Hi everybody. Have you ever started a New Year's resolution but didn't manage to make it stick? Well, let's talk about that. My name is Sinu, and you can call me Sin, spelt with an X, not an S. I'm a PhD neuroscience student at the University of Oxford, and I'm also a doctor training to be a neurologist. I talk about all things brain science related on my channel, so do check out my intro video for more information. Now, while waiting for the academic talks to start up in this new term, I thought it'd be fun to discuss habits and the science of behavior. It also ties in quite nicely if anyone's trying to start a New Year's resolution. I'm going to discuss what a habit is and 3 practical tips when starting a new habit or getting one to stick. Some of this has come from a book that I've been reading called Atomic Habits by James Clear, which is really quite good. I recommend it. It also made me review some of the science behind it, and this includes the social science as well as the neuroscience. So today in the first part, I'm going to talk about the psychology behind habits. And in the second part, I'm going to discuss what dopamine is and what it has to do with behavior and habits. So let's jump right in. Instead of my top 3 takeaways, let's do the 3 tips to building a new habit. Number 1, you have to keep it obvious. Make sure you're really clear on what you intend to do and what your intended habit is. Number 2, environment is key. Setting up the right environment could make or break your habit. And 3, try habit chaining to maximize and reinforce your behavior to ensure that your habit sticks. I'll explain this further. So let's start with, what is a habit? Well, here's a good definition. A habit is a routine or a behavior that is performed regularly, and in many cases automatically. Although the automatic part usually comes later, once the habit has been established, in my opinion. You'll find that behavior and habit are often used interchangeably in popular literature, and that's because a habit is essentially a repeated behavior or a behavior which is in a loop. So let's talk about the anatomy of the habit, or the habit cycle as some people call it. I'd like to think there are 3 fundamental parts to a habit: the cue, the action, and the reward. Now, if we can look at each different part of this habit cycle, and we can optimize each component to our benefit. So the cue is a stimulus or a trigger for the brain to want to do something. And the cue is often something very real in our environment which motivates us into action. The action is then the response to this cue. It is the physical manifestation of a habit. It is what most people on the outside see as the habit. The reward then is the end goal of the action, and it serves to satisfy our desire and motivation to do the action. But it also provides feedback to the brain to tell us that this action is worth doing again, or not worth doing again, depending on the outcome. Rewards therefore create this feedback loop that will lead to the behavior being performed regularly, and hence becoming a habit. Now let's talk about an example, and let's do a bad habit. So picture this, you're at work and your phone pings with a social media message. This notification is a cue that creates a desire to check your phone. Your action is to satisfy this cue and to pick up your phone and check it. The reward is then seeing a funny cat video which your friend has just posted. And this satisfies the motivation from the cue and the desire to check your phone. But it also causes a feedback cycle saying, next time my phone pings, I should definitely check it. Now I'll talk about this habit cycle more in the next video, because there are some interesting ways in which dopamine plays a role in the cycle. And the action of dopamine may not actually occur where you think it does. Definitely catch that video to find out more. So let's move on to the 3 practical tips for building a habit. Firstly, make it obvious. And specifically, make it obvious using an implementation plan. Psychologists call it the theory of planned behavior, and a powerful component is this implementation intention. When starting, it is not just good enough to think of a habit or even really want to do a habit. You have to make it painfully obvious what the habit is, when you will do it, and where you will do it, especially at the beginning. A study done in 2001 in the United Kingdom looked at building better exercise habits over 2 weeks in over 240 people. The participants of this study were split into 3 groups. In the first group, people were told to exercise more over the next 2 weeks and record down everything that they did in a journal. They were considered the control group, or the baseline group. The second group was known as the motivation group. These people were given a presentation with a clear explanation on why just 20 minutes of exercise is extremely beneficial for cardiovascular health and would reduce the risks of heart problems. The experimenters essentially painted exercise in a very positive light to increase motivation, and these participants reported that they did have a high level of motivation as well as intention to go off and exercise. This group also had to record the amount of exercise that they did in the following 2 weeks. Now the third group was given the same motivational presentation as the second group, so they also had a high level of motivation and intention to exercise. This group, however, also had to formalize a simple personalized exercise plan for the next 2 weeks. Now this wasn't a complex plan, but they had to formulate the sentence, "During the next week, I will partake in 20 minutes of vigorous exercise on a specific day and a specific time and at a specific place." Then they were able to leave and they were told to record their exercises as the other groups did. Now the results showed that both groups 1 and 2, about 35 to 39% of the participants exercise at least once a week. Now this is pretty interesting, as the second exercise group, or the second group, had the same amount of exercise despite having this high level of motivation to exercise. And this lends to another thought that motivation isn't really key, at least not by itself. Group 3, however, over 90% of the participants exercise at least once a week, which is double the expected rate. Now this was a simple but elegant example of how having a clear but simple implementation plan of an intention yielded a benefit on actually carrying out that new behavior. It exemplifies that, especially when starting something new, you have to just take out all that extra burden or energy in doing that behavior. Make it really easy for your brain to succeed. Don't come up with some vague, foggy notion of a habit or a desire that you want to accomplish a goal. Set a clear intention, write it down, and then all you need to do is turn up and do it. So, for your New Year's resolution, make sure you sit down first and say what you will do exactly, and when you will do it, and where you will do it. So the next practical tip follows on by that, and looking at the environment is really something that can make or break your new habit. The environment is often considered the invisible hand which shapes our behavior. Here's an interesting study done looking at American soldiers returning home from the Vietnam War. Now this was described in the book Atomic Habits, and the original study was published in 1974. Over 30% of returning American soldiers from the Vietnam War were apparently addicted to heroin. Now this was considered a major issue. So these soldiers were offered standard treatment and they were followed up. After 1 year, much to everyone's surprise, 9 out of 10 of the group of soldiers were no longer addicted. Now this contrasts strongly with the conventional wisdom in which about 90% of the average drug user who goes to a rehab will relapse after a year following their treatment. Now one conclusion drawn from this study was that the environment formed a powerful cue for the habit of heroin use. During the war, heroin was much more readily available, and soldiers they knew this, and so this was a huge factor in their addiction. However, back home, they were in a completely different environment and they were able to break their addiction. Now, if you think about it, not the soldier, but the average drug user, when they return from a rehab center, they would essentially go back into the environment in which they were previously using heroin or drugs, and that environment acts as a powerful cue to relapse. So this actually spills on to the topic of self-control. And when people think about forming a new habit or a good habit, people often feel that they have to have a lot of self-control, willpower, and be really disciplined. They almost feel that they have to work hard to make the benefits meaningful. However, studies actually show that people who appear to have a lot of self-control are actually not that different from people who do not have a lot of self-control. One big difference, however, is that these so-called disciplined individuals are actually just better at structuring their lives so that they do not need to exert self-control over their actions. So they position themselves in a way to ensure that they aren't in a situation where they have to battle their conscience. Ironically, this means that people who seemingly have the best self-control are those who actually just don't have to use it much at all. However, structuring your life is also considered a skill, and one that takes time and practice to develop. One key area that anyone can focus on is looking at their environment to help achieve their goals and to create good, lasting behavior change. Practically speaking, let's say you want to learn the guitar, and you make an implementation plan to play 20 minutes every evening in your living room. Well, that's a really good start to building a habit around learning the guitar. However, if your living room is also where your television is, this creates an environment conflict with your intention. Unfortunately, the brain is especially susceptible to distractions, and in this setting, it will choose the path of least resistance. I think that most of us would be much happier scrolling through Netflix than trying to learn some new guitar chords, which would be difficult because we're not used to it. However, just go back to the environment part. If you were to put the guitar in a different room, let's say a study room or a dining room, where there are less distractions, and that way there is less resistance to practicing every day for 20 minutes. Essentially, try to reduce the friction as much as possible. Other studies also suggest that pegging a habit to a new environment will create a powerful association between that environment and the habit, so that the context of just being in that environment will be a powerful cue for that behavior. Now, if you don't have a different room for every single habit that you want to build, don't worry. You can also try to create segregated spaces or a space within a room that is available for different habits. Therefore, changing your behavior through your environment is a simple but effective way to approach building a new habit. Finally, let's talk about temptation bundling, or habit chaining, as I call it. This is a really powerful and practical approach to building new habits and shaping our behavior. The primary tenet is that we all have behaviors or things that we like to do that we already do regularly, so essentially established habits. There are also behaviors that we want to do and we want to do regularly, so this could be the new habit that we are trying to build. Well, linking these two together is a powerful way to create stability and regularity for that new habit. I'll give you an example in my life. After dinner every night, I always make a cup of Earl Grey tea that I get to enjoy after I do the dishes. Now, having this cup of tea is my daily nighttime habit, and I really enjoy it. So I've decided to chain this with a new habit that I'm trying to build. Namely, I'm trying to work towards producing a new video for this YouTube channel every week. So every night I'll have my cup of tea while working on researching or reviewing lecture notes or editing my next video. Some people call this habit stacking, which is using a strong habit to reinforce weaker or developing ones. So in your mind, you should say, after I do my established habit, I will then do my new habit. In this instance, the established habit creates a regular cue that generates motivation to building the new habit. So that's pretty much habit chaining in a nutshell. Again, it's simple but powerful. So there you have it, the psychology and some evidence behind 3 practical tips to building a new habit and changing your behavior. Now, it's always fun to look at the practical side of behavior change because it plays such an important role in our daily lives and goals. What I didn't talk about was how a lot of these behavioral strategies also works for bad habits, and doing the inverse of what I discussed would be helpful for breaking bad habits. And in fact, why don't you let me know below what your favorite strategy when building a new habit is. Next video, I'm going to take a look at dopamine in the brain, and I'll discuss what dopamine is and what it has to do with behavior and building habits. I think you'll find that really interesting. So thanks very much. Like and subscribe down below to continue learning brain science with me, and I shall catch you at the next video.